And now, a passage from Florida Seen Through the Eyes of 19th Century Travelers by Benjamin F. Rogers. During the first half of the 19th century, there were published, both in this country and abroad, a great number of books written by travelers in all parts of the United States, and especially in the South. As one Southern author observed in 1860, the fashion has been for several years to write books about the South. Englishmen, Frenchmen, down Eastern men, the bloomer style of men, as well as countless numbers of female scribblers, have not ceased to drum upon the public tympanum, almost to deafness indeed, in praise or blame, generally the latter, of Southern peculiarities, social habits, manners, customs, observances, and domestic institutions. The most famous of the antebellum travelers, however, all seemed to skip Florida. Charles Dickens traveled widely through the North and West, but he didn't see Florida. Harriet Martineau visited with statesmen in Washington and went south to Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans, but she overlooked Florida. Frederick Law Olmsted journeyed through the seaboard slave states, into the back country, and even into Texas, but missed Florida. And neither did the Trollops nor Basil Hall. Even Lafayette, who had been granted a whole township in the vicinity of Tallahassee, did not get to Florida to see his beautiful rolling acres. Probably the main reason that Florida had so few visitors during the antebellum period was that it was off the beaten track and that transportation into the state was difficult. Concerning the trip from Savannah to Jacksonville, one traveler wrote as late as 1875, "There are two ways of getting to Jacksonville, and whichever you choose, you will be sorry you had not taken the other. There is the night train by railroad, which brings you to Jacksonville in about 16 hours, and there is the steamboat line, which goes inland nearly all the way, which may land you in a day, or you may run aground and remain on board for a week. As for the trip from Mobile to Pensacola, William Howard Russell, correspondent for the London Times, observed in 1862 that it was most tedious and exceedingly comfortless in all respects, through a waste of sand in which we ran the chance of being smothered or lost, and that in the 40 miles between Fort Morgan and Pensacola, not a human habitation disturbs the domain sacred to alligators, serpents, pelicans, and wild fowl." If transportation problems were not enough to keep travelers from visiting Florida, there were also the Seminole Indians, who were a problem during much of the antebellum period. As late as 1857, James Sterling referred to Seminole attacks on some of the settlements along the St. Johns River. Little wonder that Florida had not yet become a popular stopping point for northern visitors. It was really after the war that travelers and immigrants began to enter Florida in considerable numbers. These outsiders had come from a great diversity of places for a great diversity of reasons. Not all of those who came south wrote books about their experiences, but many did, and it is from the observations of some of these that this article is drawn. Represented in this group, among others, are the reporters Whitelaw Reid, Edward King, and Julian Ralph, the doctor Daniel G. Brinton, and two northerners who eventually came south to live, George Barber and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Though most observers apparently really tried to be objective, the effort at impartiality is best seen in the title of a book by one Oliver Crosby, Florida Facts Both Bright and Blue, a guidebook to intending settlers, tourists, and investors from a northerner's standpoint, plain, unvarnished truth without taffy, no advertisements or puffs. During the late 19th century, the customary port of entry into Florida was Jacksonville, and it was here that the average visitor made his headquarters. Sometime during his stay, he would make the trip up the St. Johns River to Enterprise, and perhaps also up the Ocklawaha to Silver Springs. Most tourists who took the St. Johns trip stopped at Tocoi or Piccolata and went overland to St. Augustine by coach. One of our observers has described this trip for us. Deep white sand obstructs the stage, and not so rarely as one wishes, the wheels strike a pine or palmetto root with a most unpleasant effect on the passengers, especially if they are invalids. After 3.5 hours of this torture, the stage is checked by the Sebastian River, over which a miserable ferry conveys the tourist who at length finds himself in St. Augustine. Occasionally, a truly adventuresome soul would travel down the east coast as far as Volusia County, but beyond that, only the most hardened and curious traveler ventured. Miami, of course, was a little fishing village whose sole contact with the outside world was the barefoot mailman who walked along the beach for 90 miles, during which he saw only one house. As time passed, and as settlers began to move into the vicinity of Orlando, which was then called Southern Florida, some travelers visited there, and with the completion of the East-West Railroad from Jacksonville to New Orleans, a few visitors made it out to Middle Florida to see the state capital at Tallahassee. The climate. Wherever the visitors came from and however they entered the state, they were almost unanimously impressed with Florida's climate. They referred to it as exquisite, absolutely delicious, Florida's chief charm, one continuous spring, surpassing Italy, the lotus eater's paradise, a child's Eden, the finest winter climate in the United States, and Nathaniel Parker Willis on a 1st of May picturesquely noted the morning air by which a newborn child would be sufficiently clad. Some northerners apparently did grumble when they hit Florida during a cold wave, but these were the exceptions, as were those who complained about the hot summers. In the words of Oliver Crosby, Florida summers are supposed by winter residents or prospective settlers to be our greatest drawback, and it is pleasant to note their surprise as upon experience they declare it is not so hot as in New York. If travelers praised the climate, native Floridians were proud of it. As Crosby observed, "How do you like our climate?" was the universal question asked each newcomer, much as one would say our house, our gun, or our horse, as though the speaker were in some way part proprietor in such a glorious affair and wanted some of the credit. Sure of an enthusiastic reply in the climate's favor, he pushes the subject forward on every occasion, gloats over the newspaper telegraphic reports of northern blizzards or snow blockades, and is even charged with selling the climate at so much per acre over worthless land. Scenery. Florida's scenery came in for somewhat less praise than its climate. As Mrs. Stowe remarked, tourists and travelers generally come with their heads full of certain romantic ideas of waving palms, orange groves, flowers, and fruit all bursting forth in tropical abundance, and they find a dead sandy level with patches behind them of rough, coarse grass and tall pine trees whose tops are so far in the air that they seem to cast no shade, and a little scrubby underbrush. Those travelers who got as far as Tallahassee, however, were unstinted in their praise, while the St. Johns River also received its due share. Even James Sterling, an Englishman who had few good words to say for anything American, referred to the St. Johns as beautiful and interesting, and then paid it the supreme compliment. It was, he said, more like an English river than any he had previously seen. It was along the St. Johns River that most travelers had their first glimpse of a real live, full-grown alligator, and they were invariably impressed. Prior to the war, men had killed them just for the fun of it. James Sterling in 1857 heard of a hunting party which had bagged 75. After the war, the commercial exploitation of the alligator really got underway, and in the 1890s, Julian Ralph remarked that the main street of Jacksonville was fit to be called Alligator Avenue because of the myriad ways in which that animal is offered as a sacrifice to the curiosity and thoughtlessness of the crowds. I did not happen to see any alligators served on toast there, but I saw them stuffed and skinned, turned into bags, or kept in tanks and boxes and cages, their babies made into ornaments or on sale as toys, their claws used as purses, their teeth as jewelry, their eggs as curios. Figures of them were carved on canes, molded on souvenir spoons, painted on china, and sold in forms of photographs, watercolor studies, breast pins, and carvings. Undoubtedly, this was the reason why, long before 1900, there were hardly alligators enough to show the tourists. Economic development. In addition to their opinions on Florida's climate, scenery, and alligators, the visitors also had a good deal to say about its present state and future possibilities of economic development. The remarks on Jacksonville are typical of what they said about the state as a whole. This port of entry for travelers was a small town of 2,000, counting slaves, in 1860, and the war dealt it several disastrous blows. Occupied 3 times by Union troops and partly burned during the Third Occupation, Jacksonville had grass growing waist-high in the streets and cattle bedded down in deserted homes when the war was over. It is small wonder that Whitelaw Reid, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Yankee anyway, was not particularly impressed with what he saw there in 1866. Within a very few years, however, other travelers were marveling at the rapid progress made in the economic reconstruction of the city. By 1870, its population had increased to 7,000, and Ledyard Bill noted that the waste and stagnation caused by the war had disappeared. Whichever way we turn, continue Mr. Bill, new buildings and stores greet our view, old ones being enlarged, streets cleaned and substantial. In short, new impulses and new ideas have seized the town, and its present watchword is forward. Jacksonville continued to grow and progress during the 1870s and 1880s, and by 1890 it had 17,000 permanent residents and an estimated 20,000 winter visitors, enough for at least one northern traveler to refer to it as a metropolis. Northern enthusiasm over Florida's urban progress was no more pronounced than their enthusiasm over her progress in the field of agriculture. Here they saw immense opportunities in citrus culture and cattle raising, but they also expanded a list of possible crops, some of which are still only in the possible class, to include coffee, tea, cane, indigo, wine grapes, tobacco, rice, watermelons, wheat, corn, potatoes, cassava, silk, quince, figs, peaches, apricots, guava, pomegranate, citron, shaddock, coconut, plums, bananas, olives, tamarind, arrowroot, and pistache. George Barber's story of two bright young New York lads who had cleared $1,800 on an acre of pineapples was typical of the rose-colored glasses with which the visitors looked at Florida's agricultural possibilities. As Ledger Bill put it, the capabilities of the state in an agricultural point of view are unbounded. Tourists. In addition to the bright future in agriculture, northern observers also saw possibilities in timber, fisheries, and the manufacture of lead pencils. But the economic opportunity which was most impressive to the northerner was in the tourist trade. Before the war, there had been a limited number of tourists visiting the Upper East Coast, most of them coming for their health. In 1857, James Sterling had referred to Jacksonville as the principal resort of invalids on the St. Johns, and had remarked of St. Augustine that it was chiefly noted as a resort for invalids from the north, the climate of Florida having acquired some renown as a restorative for consumptive patients. Immediately after the war, Whitelaw Reid had suggested that Florida might again become a resort for debilitated people from the north, and for the next few years, most of those who journeyed to Florida in the winter went there for their health. In 1869, Brinton remarked of Jacksonville that it was a favorite residence of invalids during the winter months, so much so that the very sight of the sick often affected one unfavorably. Meanwhile, however, there was a growing admixture of pleasure seekers. Bill, in 1869, noted some vacationers among the invalids, and within 5 years, Edward King estimated that there were 3 crusading to find the phantom pleasure for everyone who came south because of his health. During the 1880s, the percentage of invalids and consumptives continued to decline while the tourist business boomed. As one observer himself, a northerner, noted, the winter visitors were usually wealthy and equipped with more prejudices than their well-filled traveling bags would contain, and their chief desire was to find an elegant hotel. By the 1890s, this sort of tourist had almost completely replaced the invalids. As Julian Ralph remarked in 1896, I have seen but few persons who had the appearance of being victims of any lung disease. Florida was the resort of invalids for many years, but those who spent their winters there now go to the so-called piney woods and mountain resorts of Georgia and the Carolinas. Florida, on the other hand, continued Ralph, has become a resting place for those who can afford to loaf at the busiest time of the year, the men who have made their piles or organized their business to run automatically. As a rule, they are beyond the middle age and of comfortable figures. Settlers. All of the northerners observed by our travelers, however, were not tourists. Actually, one of the most interesting facts about Florida's economic development in the late 19th century was the large part played by northern immigrants. We're all familiar with the names of Plant and Flagler and Deland and Stetson and Sanford, but there were many thousands of lesser renown who also played their parts. Even discounting the natural tendency of northern travelers to exaggerate northern contributions, the evidence is amazing. Edward King noted in 1874 that Jacksonville had been rebuilt according to the New England pattern, and estimated that half its resident population was from the northern states. And at Palatka, which had a cheery, neat New England look, he found most of the orange groves owned by northerners. A decade later, George Barber, traveling through the state, was everywhere amazed by the number of northern immigrants he found. At Altamonte, he found the residents were generally cultured people from the north. In Tampa, he noted that the new real estate developments in the suburbs were named after northern states, and that those who settled in them were nearly all northern people. In Volusia County, he was surprised to see that nearly all the villages and settlements were composed of exactly the right sort of northern stock. It is little wonder that with pardonable exaggeration he concluded Florida is rapidly becoming a northern colony. Travelers in Florida, of course, observed southerners as well as northerners, and in general they were very favorably impressed. As early as 1868, Harriet Beecher Stowe was quoted in the Hartford, Connecticut Times Mrs. Stowe says the Southern people are no more inclined to resist the laws or foster the spirit of rebellion than Vermont is. Mr. Sumner and his friends will not like this testimony, but it is hers. She even tested the real feeling of the people in her somewhat extended journeys all over Florida and found them so kind that they would even surrender their own sleeping accommodations to her. They desire only peace and the restoration of the Union. Oliver Crosby found his admiration increasing for a people that have borne such grievous burdens so uncomplainingly and testified to many warm friendships between one-time Union soldiers and ex-Confederates. There were some places, however, where Northerners were not completely accepted. In the words of George Barber, it was entirely useless for the Northern immigrant to expect to become an intimately familiar guest and neighbor of the old residents and aristocrats of the South. But though one could not expect intimate friendship, continued Barber, in health and sickness, in trouble or disaster, you will always receive kindly attention, care, and assistance from these excellent people if you at all deserve it.